It was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you want to run outside and play. The sky was blue, the birds were chirping, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves on the trees. In a little neighborhood with neat houses and green lawns, something fun was happening. There, in the backyard of one house, was a big, round trampoline. And on that trampoline, a boy named Jake. Jake was 12 years old, with messy brown hair and a huge smile that showed how much he loved bouncing. Up and down he went, boing, 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 like he could touch the clouds if he tried hard enough. His sneakers squeaked a little every time he landed, and his laugh echoed across the yard. For Jake, this was the best way to spend a Saturday. No school, no homework, just bouncing and having fun. Jake's mom, Sarah, was sitting on the porch watching him. She had a tall glass of cold lemonade in her hand, the ice clinking against the sides as she took a sip. Sarah had short, curly hair and a kind face that always seemed to be smiling when she looked at Jake. She wore a blue t-shirt and comfy jeans, her feet resting on a little stool. To her, this moment was perfect. The sun was warm but not too hot, the lemonade was sweet, and her son was happy. She leaned back in her chair and thought to herself, life doesn't get any better than this. The neighborhood was quiet, well, mostly quiet, except for Jake's giggles and the soft thump of the trampoline. It felt like nothing could go wrong on a day like this. But oh, was she wrong about that? Something big was about to happen, something no one saw coming. Now, let's look across the street. That's where Linda lived. Linda wasn't like Sarah or Jake. She didn't sit on porches sipping lemonade or bounce on trampolines. No, Linda was different. She was the lady everyone in the neighborhood talked about, but not in a good way. Linda was tall and skinny, with sharp eyes that always seemed to be looking for trouble. Her hair was pulled back tight in a bun, and she wore glasses that sat low on her nose so she could peek over them and glare at people. She lived in a house with perfect flowers and a lawn so neat it looked like she trimmed it with scissors. And guess what? She kind of did. Linda was the queen of the HOA, that's the group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like how tall your grass can be or what color your mailbox has to be. Linda loved those rules more than anything. She carried a little ruler in her pocket and measured people's grass to make sure it wasn't too long. If it was even a tiny bit over the limit, she'd write a note and stick it on your door. Grass too tall, the note would say, or mailbox looks dirty. She wrote so many notes that people started calling her HOA Karen when she wasn't around. They'd whisper it and laugh, but they were also a little scared of her. To most people, Linda seemed harmless, just super annoying. She'd knock on doors and complain about silly things, like if someone's dog barked once or if a kid left a toy in the yard. This neighborhood has standards, she'd say, waving her ruler like it was a magic wand. Everyone rolled their eyes and tried to ignore her. Sarah had dealt with Linda before. One time, Linda came over because Jake's soccer ball rolled into her yard. Balls don't belong here, Linda had said, holding the ball like it was a rotten apple. Sarah just smiled and took it back, saying, sorry, Linda, won't happen again. She didn't argue because she didn't want trouble. Jake thought Linda was funny, like a grumpy cartoon character. He'd giggle and say, she's so mad about everything. Sarah would nod and tell him, just let her be, Jake. She's not worth getting upset over. So, on this sunny Saturday, Sarah wasn't thinking about Linda at all. She was too busy enjoying the day with Jake. But that was about to change. See, Linda wasn't outside yet, but she was watching. From her window, she could see Jake bouncing on the trampoline. Her curtains were pulled back just a little, and her sharp eyes followed every jump. Up, down, up, down. To Linda, that trampoline wasn't fun, it was a problem. She didn't like the noise it made, that little thump-thump every time Jake landed. She didn't like how it looked in the yard, all big and colorful. And most of all, she didn't like that Jake and Sarah were having a good time while she sat inside with her rules and her ruler. Linda tapped her fingers on the windowsill, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was thinking hard about what to do. This can't go on, she told herself. I'm in charge here. They need to know that. Linda wasn't the kind of person who let things slide. If something bothered her, she'd fix it or at least try to. And right now, that trampoline was bothering her a lot. Jake kept bouncing, totally unaware that Linda was staring at him. He did a big jump and shouted, Mom, look. I'm flying. Sarah laughed and clapped her hands. "You're the best jumper I've ever seen," she called back. The trampoline springs squeaked a little louder as Jake tried to go even higher. He was having the time of his life, his cheeks pink from all the fun. The sun sparkled off the metal frame of the trampoline, making it shine like a toy from a movie. To Jake, this was his kingdom. He was the king of the trampoline, ruler of the backyard. Nothing could stop him, not homework, not bedtime, and definitely not some grumpy lady across the street. At least, that's what he thought. He didn't know Linda was about to make her move. Sarah took another sip of lemonade, the ice cubes jingling in her glass. She looked at Jake and felt so happy. This was what Saturdays were for: playing outside, laughing, making memories. She remembered when she was a kid, how she'd run around with her friends until the sun went down. Now, seeing Jake so full of energy brought all those feelings back. She adjusted her chair to get comfy and watched him do a silly flip. "Careful, Jake," she said, but she wasn't really worried. He'd been jumping on that trampoline for months and never got hurt. It was sturdy and safe, a birthday gift from his grandpa. Sarah loved how much joy it brought him. She had no idea that joy was about to turn into something else, something loud and crazy. Back across the street, Linda made up her mind. She let the curtain fall and turned away from the window. Her house was quiet, too quiet, like it was waiting for something to happen. She walked to her kitchen, her shoes clicking on the shiny floor. Everything in Linda's house was perfect, too perfect. The counters were spotless, the chairs lined up just right, not a speck of dust anywhere. It was like a house from a magazine, but it didn't feel warm or happy. It felt cold, like Linda herself. She grabbed her phone off the table and held it tight. Her fingers hovered over the buttons. She was thinking about calling someone who could make the trampoline stop. But who? She paced back and forth, her mind racing. They think they can do whatever they want, she thought. Not on my street. Not while I'm here. Linda wasn't just annoyed, she was mad. Really mad. And when Linda got mad, things got messy. Jake did another big bounce, his hair flying in the wind. "Mom, I bet I can jump higher than the house," he yelled. Sarah chuckled and shook her head. "Oh, I'd love to see that," she said. She didn't notice Linda's front door creaking open across the street. She didn't see Linda step outside, her phone in one hand and that ruler in the other. Linda's face was red, her eyes narrowed. She looked like a storm cloud ready to burst. The neighborhood was still peaceful for now, birds singing, a lawnmower humming a few houses away, but that peace wasn't going to last. Linda had a plan, and it was going to shake everything up. What do you think she's about to do? Scream? Yell? Call someone? Keep guessing, because this sunny Saturday is about to get wild. Let's rewind a tiny bit and talk about Jake some more. He wasn't just any kid, he was the kind of boy who made everyone smile. He had a freckled nose and bright green eyes that sparkled when he was excited. At school, he was the kid who shared his snacks and helped his friends with math. At home, he was Sarah's little helper, carrying groceries or watering the flowers. He wasn't perfect, he forgot to clean his room sometimes, but he had a big heart. That trampoline was his favorite thing in the world. His grandpa gave it to him for his 12th birthday, and Jake hugged him so hard he almost fell over. "This is the best gift ever," Jake had said, and he meant it. Every weekend since then, he'd been out there jumping, rain or shine. It was his happy place, his escape from everything else. Sarah loved that about him. She worked hard at her job, she was a nurse at the hospital downtown, and sometimes she came home tired. But seeing Jake's smile made all that tiredness go away. She'd sit on the porch like she was now, watching him play, and feel like the luckiest mom alive. Their house wasn't fancy, just a little place with a red door and a small garden, but it was home. The backyard was big enough for the trampoline and a swing set, and that's all Jake needed. Sarah kept it simple, no big decorations, no fancy stuff. She didn't care about impressing people like Linda did. She just wanted a safe, happy place for her and Jake. And until today, it had been exactly that. Linda, though. She cared about everything, every little detail. Her house had white shutters and a red roof, and every flower in her garden was lined up like soldiers. She'd been the HOA president for 3 years, and she acted like it was the most important job in the world. She had a notebook full of rules, and she checked them every day. If someone parked their car too close to her driveway, she'd write a note. If a kid rode a bike on the sidewalk, she'd shake her head and mutter about safety. The neighbors tried to stay out of her way. Mr. Thompson next door once said, "Linda's like a hawk, always watching, always ready to swoop." Everyone laughed, but they knew it was true. Linda didn't miss a thing, or so she thought. On this Saturday, though, Linda wasn't thinking about grass or bikes. She was thinking about that trampoline. It had been there for months, but today it felt louder, bigger, more in her face. She stood on her front step, staring across the street at Jake. He was still bouncing, his shadow stretching long across the grass. Sarah was still on the porch, her lemonade glass half empty now. The day was still bright and perfect for them. But for Linda, it was a battle. She gripped her phone tighter and took a deep breath. She was about to do something big, something that would make everyone stop and stare. What do you think it is? Will she yell at Jake? Will she march over and tell Sarah off? Or maybe something even crazier? Hang on tight, because this story's about to flip upside down. Jake landed with a big thump and waved at his mom. "Did you see that one?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "Amazing," she said. She didn't see Linda stepping off her porch. She didn't hear Linda muttering under her breath, "Enough is enough." The neighborhood was about to get noisy, not from the trampoline, but from something way bigger. Linda had a plan, and it wasn't just a little complaint this time. She was ready to make waves, to show everyone who was boss. But here's the fun part, she didn't know what was coming her way. This sunny day was hiding a surprise, one that would turn everything around. Can you guess what's next? Keep reading, because you won't believe it. The sunny Saturday afternoon was about to get loud, not from Jake's trampoline, but from something else entirely. Linda, the HOA queen, stormed out of her house like a tornado, ready to tear everything apart. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest, and her face was scrunched up in a glare so mean it could have melted ice. She stood on her perfect lawn, staring across the street at Jake like he'd just set her mailbox on fire. Jake was still on the trampoline, mid-bounce, when her voice cut through the air like a whistle. "That trampoline's too loud," she yelled. Her words were sharp and angry, loud enough to scare the little birds that had been chirping in the trees. They fluttered away fast, leaving the neighborhood quieter for just a second until Linda kept going. Jake froze, his sneakers planted on the trampoline. He didn't bounce anymore. His big green eyes got wide, like saucers, as he looked at Linda. He wasn't sure what to say. Was she really mad about his jumping? It didn't even seem that loud to him, just a little thump-thump every time he landed. He glanced at his mom, Sarah, hoping she'd know what to do. Sarah was already stepping forward, off the porch and onto the grass. She moved slow and calm, like she wasn't scared of Linda at all. Her lemonade glass sat on the porch table, forgotten for now. She brushed her curly hair out of her face and said, "Linda, it's just kids playing. It's not even close to the noise rules." Her voice was steady, soft, like she was trying to keep the peace. Sarah knew the HOA rules. Linda had made everyone read them a million times. There was nothing about trampolines being too loud, especially not on a Saturday afternoon when kids were supposed to have fun. But Linda? Oh, she wasn't listening. Not even a little bit. Her glare got sharper, and she uncrossed her arms just so she could point a bony finger right at Sarah. "I'm calling the cops," she snapped, her voice rising like a siren. "You'll see who's in charge around here." The way she said it made it sound like a promise, like she was the boss of the whole street and everyone better listen. Her lips curled into a smirk, a sneaky little smile that made her look like she knew something no one else did. Jake's mouth dropped open. The cops? For a trampoline? He couldn't believe it. He looked at his mom again, his heart beating a little faster now. Was he in trouble? He didn't mean to make anyone mad. He just wanted to bounce and have fun. Sarah didn't flinch, though. She just sighed, a long, tired sound, like she'd heard Linda's threats before. And she had. Linda was always complaining about something: dogs barking, cars parking wrong, kids being kids. Sarah had learned to nod and let it go, because arguing with Linda was like arguing with a brick wall. But this time? Something felt off. Linda's smirk was too big, too smug, like she had a secret up her sleeve. Sarah crossed her arms and tilted her head, watching Linda closely. She didn't say anything yet, but her mind was spinning. What's she up to? She wondered. This isn't just about the trampoline. The air felt heavier now, like a storm was brewing, even though the sun was still shining bright. Linda turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, her shoes clicking on the pavement. She was still yelling, even as she walked away. Too loud. Too much noise. I won't stand for it. Her voice bounced off the houses, making a few neighbors peek out their windows. Mr. Thompson, the old man next door to Linda, pulled his curtain back and shook his head. He'd seen Linda's tantrums before everyone had. But this one seemed bigger, louder, like she was putting on a show. Jake slid off the trampoline and ran to his mom's side. Is she really calling the police? He whispered, his voice small. Sarah put a hand on his shoulder and said, Don't worry, Jake. She's just mad. It'll be okay. But even as she said it, she wasn't so sure. Linda's smirk stuck in her mind, like a puzzle she couldn't figure out. Across the street, Linda disappeared into her house, slamming the door behind her. The bang echoed, and then it was quiet again, too quiet. Jake looked up at Sarah. Why does she hate the trampoline so much? He asked. Sarah shrugged. She doesn't like anything fun, I guess. She's always been that way. It was true. Linda had been grumpy ever since Sarah and Jake moved in 2 years ago. She'd complained about their moving truck being too big, about Jake riding his bike too fast, about Sarah planting flowers that weren't approved. Sarah tried to be nice, but Linda made it hard. Jake frowned. She's like the mean witch in a story, he said. Sarah laughed a little. Maybe. But witches don't win in the end, right? Jake nodded, but he still looked worried. Inside her house, Linda was pacing. Her perfect kitchen gleamed shiny counters, spotless floor, but she didn't care about that right now. She held her phone in one hand, tapping it against her palm. They think they can ignore me, she thought. They think I'm a joke. Her face was still red from yelling, and her glasses slid down her nose. She pushed them back up and muttered to herself, that trampoline's got to go. I'll make it stop. She hated the sound of it, the thump 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 that she could hear even through her closed windows. She hated how happy Jake looked, bouncing like he didn't have a care in the world. Linda didn't like happy. She liked rules, order, control. And right now, she felt like she was losing all of that. Sarah and Jake stood in the yard, watching Linda's house. The curtains were closed now, but they could imagine her stomping around inside. What do we do, Mom? Jake asked. Sarah smiled down at him. Nothing yet. Let's just wait and see. She might calm down. But deep down, Sarah didn't think Linda would calm down. That smirk, it was like Linda had a trick ready, something mean and sneaky. Sarah had seen Linda mad before, but this was different. It wasn't just a grumpy neighbor thing anymore. It felt bigger, like Linda was about to start a war over a trampoline. Jake kicked at the grass. I don't want the cops to come, he said quietly. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. They won't take you away for jumping, I promise. She tried to sound sure, but her eyes stayed on Linda's house. The neighborhood was still for a minute. The birds came back, chirping like nothing had happened. A squirrel ran across the street, its tiny feet pattering on the pavement. But the quiet didn't feel peaceful, it felt like the calm before something big. Linda wasn't done. She wasn't the type to yell and then give up. She was planning something, and that smirk meant it was going to be trouble. Sarah remembered a time last summer when Linda got mad about a barbecue at Mr. Thompson's house. She'd called the HOA and tried to shut it down, saying the smoke was against the rules. It didn't work, everyone just ignored her, but she'd been so proud of herself for trying. This time, though, she wasn't calling the HOA. She'd said cops. That was a whole new level of crazy. Jake climbed back onto the trampoline, but he didn't bounce. He sat there, legs crossed, looking at his mom. Do you think she's really calling them? He asked again. Sarah sighed. Maybe. But even if she does, they won't care about a trampoline. They've got bigger things to worry about. She hoped she was right. Jake nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He pulled at a loose thread on his shorts, his eyebrows scrunched together. She's so mean, he said. Why can't she just let me play? Sarah didn't have a good answer. Some people don't like seeing others happy, she said. It makes them feel small. Jake tilted his head. That's dumb. Sarah laughed. Yeah, it is. Inside, Linda stopped pacing. She stood by her window, peeking through a tiny gap in the curtains. She could see Jake sitting on the trampoline, Sarah next to him. They weren't scared, they were talking, even laughing a little. That made Linda madder. They're laughing at me, she thought. They think I'm nothing. She clutched her phone tighter and started dialing. Her fingers shook a little, but she didn't stop. Hello, yes, this is an emergency, she said when someone answered. Her voice was loud again, like she wanted the whole world to hear. There's a noise problem on my street. It's disturbing the peace. She nodded as she talked, like she was agreeing with herself. Yes, a trampoline. It's too loud. You need to send someone right now. Sarah couldn't hear what Linda was saying, but she saw the curtain move. She knew Linda was up to something. She's on the phone, she said to Jake. He looked over, his eyes big again. With the police, he asked. Sarah shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe she's just pretending to scare us. But that smirk flashed in Sarah's mind again, and she felt a little chill. Linda wasn't pretending. She was serious this time. Jake hugged his knees. I don't like her, he said. Sarah nodded. Me neither, buddy. But we'll be okay. She hoped she sounded braver than she felt. The day was still sunny, but it didn't feel as warm anymore. Linda had changed it, turned it into something tense and strange. What was Linda hiding? That smirk wasn't just about being mad, it was like she knew something Sarah and Jake didn't. Sarah thought back to the last few weeks. She'd noticed weird things about Linda's house: cars pulling up late at night, the garage door always open just a crack. She hadn't paid much attention then, but now it felt important. Was Linda really just mad about the trampoline, or was there more to it? The tension was growing, like a rubber band stretching tighter and tighter. Something was going to snap soon, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Hang on, because this story's about to get wild. What do you think Linda's secret is? Keep guessing, you'll find out soon. The sunny Saturday was turning into a big mess, and it all started with Linda. She stood on her perfect lawn, her arms waving like she was trying to shoo away a swarm of bees. She whipped out her phone from her pocket so fast it was like magic. Her fingers punched the buttons 9-1-1 and she held it to her ear, yelling before anyone even answered. There's a disturbance here, she shouted, her voice loud and scratchy. It's disturbing the peace. Unruly kids making noise. She pointed at Jake's trampoline across the street, her face red and her eyes wild. She looked like she was ready to explode, and she didn't care who heard her. The whole neighborhood could probably hear her, she was that loud. Jake was still standing in the yard next to his mom, Sarah. He watched Linda with his mouth hanging open a little. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Is she serious? He whispered to Sarah, his voice quiet and shaky. He didn't understand why Linda was so mad. It was just a trampoline. Kids bounced on trampolines all the time. It wasn't like he was breaking windows or setting off fireworks. Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes locked on Linda. Yeah, she's serious, she said softly. But her face changed, her eyes got narrower, like she was trying to figure something out. Sarah wasn't just watching Linda yell. She was thinking hard, remembering things she'd seen lately that didn't add up. Something about Linda was weird, and it wasn't just her temper. See, Sarah had noticed stuff about Linda's house over the past few weeks. Little things that seemed strange but didn't bother her much until now. Linda's garage door was always open just a tiny bit, like she didn't want it closed all the way. And at night, when Sarah was up late reading or watching TV, she'd see cars pull into Linda's driveway. Not normal cars like the neighbors drove, but different ones, big, dark ones that didn't belong. They'd stay for a few minutes, then leave fast. Sarah hadn't thought much about it before. She figured Linda had friends or something. But now, watching Linda scream about the trampoline, those weird things started to feel important. What was going on over there? Was Linda hiding something? Sarah's stomach felt a little funny, like when you know a surprise is coming but you're not sure if it's good or bad. Meanwhile, Linda kept ranting. She didn't stop for a second. This street is a mess, she yelled into the phone. Kids running wild. No one follows the rules anymore. She waved her free hand in the air, her glasses slipping down her nose. She pushed them back up and kept going. I'm the HOA president. I say what's allowed, and that trampoline isn't. She acted like she owned the whole street, like every house, every yard, every blade of grass belonged to her. Jake looked at his mom again. She's crazy, he said, his voice a little louder now. Sarah smiled, but it was a small, tight smile. Maybe, she said. But let's see what happens. She didn't want Jake to worry, but she couldn't shake that funny feeling in her gut. Here's the wild part, though, while Linda was busy shouting and waving her arms, something sneaky was happening behind her. A police car rolled up super quiet, like a cat sneaking through the grass. Its tires barely made a sound on the pavement. The car stopped right at the edge of Linda's lawn, and two officers stepped out. They were tall and serious, with dark uniforms and shiny badges. One had a clipboard in his hand, and the other had his arms crossed, like he was waiting for something. Their faces didn't smile, they looked like they meant business. But Linda? She didn't even notice. She was too caught up in her yelling, her back to the street, her phone pressed hard against her ear. Yes, send someone now, she barked. This has to stop. Jake saw the police car first. His eyes got huge, like two big green marbles. Mom, he whispered, tugging her arm. Look. Sarah turned her head, and her breath caught in her throat. The cops were here already? That was fast. Too fast. Linda was still talking to 911, but the police were standing right behind her. Sarah blinked. Wait a minute, she said quietly. She just called them. How are they here so quick? Jake frowned. Did she call them before? He asked. Sarah shook her head. I don't think so. Something's weird. Her mind raced back to those strange cars, that cracked open garage door. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but she knew this wasn't just about the trampoline anymore. The officers didn't move closer, not yet. They stood by their car, watching Linda like she was a show on TV. The one with the clipboard scribbled something down, and the other one tilted his head, listening to her yells. Linda kept going, totally clueless. It's an emergency, she shouted. Noise everywhere. I can't even think. She stomped her foot on the grass, like a kid having a tantrum. Jake giggled a little, even though he was nervous. She looks silly, he said. Sarah nodded, but her eyes stayed on the cops. They weren't rushing over to her or Jake. They weren't even looking at the trampoline. They were focused on Linda. Why? What did they want with her? Sarah took a step closer to Jake, keeping him near. She didn't know what was happening, but she didn't like it. Linda's ranting was loud enough to wake up the whole neighborhood now. A few more curtains twitched. Mr. Thompson peeked out again, and Mrs. Carter down the street opened her door a crack. Everyone wanted to see what the fuss was about. Linda didn't care. She was in her own world, yelling about rules and peace and how Jake was ruining everything. But the cops behind her? They weren't here for Jake. Sarah could feel it. That funny feeling in her stomach got stronger. Stay close, Jake, she whispered. He nodded, his hand grabbing hers. Linda finally paused to take a breath, her chest puffing up and down. She lowered the phone for a second and glared across the street at Sarah and Jake. You'll see, she said, pointing again. The police will fix this. They'll make you take that thing down. Her smirk came back, that sneaky little smile that made Sarah's skin prickle. It was like Linda thought she'd already won. But she still hadn't turned around. She didn't know the cops were right there, just a few steps away. Jake squeezed Sarah's hand. Why's she smiling like that? He asked. Sarah didn't answer right away. She was too busy watching, waiting. That smirk meant something, and she was starting to guess it wasn't good. The officer with the clipboard took a step forward, his boots quiet on the grass. He cleared his throat, a loud ahem, that cut through Linda's yelling. She jumped a little, like she'd been stung by a bee, and spun around. Her phone almost slipped out of her hand, but she caught it. What? She snapped, her eyes darting to the cops. For a second, she looked happy, like she thought they were there to help her. Oh, good, she said. You got here fast. It's about time someone did something about that noise. She pointed at the trampoline again, her smirk growing bigger. But the officers didn't smile back. They didn't nod or agree. They just stared at her, their faces hard like stone. Sarah watched it all, her heart beating a little faster. "Jake," she whispered, "they're not looking at us." Jake tilted his head. "Who are they here for then?" he asked. Sarah didn't know yet, but she had a guess. Those strange cars, the garage door, Linda's weird smirk, it was all starting to make sense, like a puzzle coming together. Linda thought the cops were her friends, but the way they stood there, so quiet and serious, told a different story. Why were they really here? It wasn't for the trampoline, that was for sure. Something bigger was happening, something Linda didn't expect. Linda kept talking, not noticing how strange the cops looked. "That trampoline's been a problem for months," she said. "I've told them to stop, but they won't listen. You need to make them take it down." She waved her arms again, her voice getting louder. The officer with the clipboard wrote something else down, his pen scratching fast. The other one stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and calm. Linda stopped, her mouth still open. "What?" she asked, blinking at him. She sounded annoyed, like he was interrupting her big moment. But the officer didn't back down. "We need to talk to you," he said. Linda frowned. "About what?" "I'm the one who called you." Sarah's eyes widened. "She doesn't get it," she whispered to Jake. He nodded, his mouth a little O of surprise. The cops weren't rushing to help Linda, they were here for her. But why? What had she done? Sarah thought about those late-night cars again. Maybe Linda wasn't just a grumpy neighbor. Maybe she was up to something sneaky, something bad. The tension was thick now, like the air before a thunderstorm. Linda's smirk started to fade, just a tiny bit, as the officers stepped closer. She still didn't know what was coming, but Sarah and Jake could feel it. Something big was about to happen. "Oh, you're gonna love this next part, hang on tight." The sunny Saturday afternoon was about to explode with the craziest moment yet. Linda stood on her lawn, still yelling into her phone about Jake's trampoline, when everything changed. The two police officers, who had been standing quietly by their car, started walking. Their boots crunched on the grass, slow and steady, but they didn't even look at Sarah or Jake. They walked right past them, straight toward Linda like she was the only person on the street. Sarah and Jake stood frozen in their yard, watching with wide eyes. The air felt heavy, like something huge was about to happen. Linda didn't see the cops coming, she was too busy shouting into her phone, her arms waving like a wild bird. The officer with the clipboard stopped just a few steps from Linda. He was tall, with a serious face and a deep voice. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough to cut through her yelling. Linda stopped talking right in the middle of a sentence. Her phone was still pressed to her ear, but her mouth snapped shut. She turned her head slow, like she wasn't sure she'd heard right. "Are you Linda Perkins?" the officer asked. His eyes locked on her, and he didn't blink. Linda blinked a lot, though. Her sharp eyes got big, and her glasses slid down her nose. She pushed them back up with a shaky hand. Yes, why," she said, her voice all wobbly now. She didn't sound mad anymore, she sounded confused, maybe even a little scared. Across the street, Sarah's jaw dropped. Her mouth fell open so wide you could have tossed a ball in there. Jake's eyes got huge, like two giant green balloons. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. The cops weren't here for the trampoline, they were here for Linda. But why? What did she do? Sarah grabbed Jake's hand without even thinking, holding it tight. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew it was big. Linda's phone slipped a little in her hand, but she caught it. She stared at the officers, her face turning pink, then red, like a tomato ripening fast. The second officer stepped forward. He was shorter than the first one, with a buzzed haircut and a stern look. He reached into his belt and pulled out something shiny, handcuffs. They dangled from his hand, glinting in the sunlight. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice calm but strong. "For illegal activity in your home. We've been watching you for weeks." The words hit like a thunderclap. Linda's phone fell out of her hand this time, landing on the grass with a soft thud. She didn't even try to pick it up. "What?" she shouted, her voice cracking. "This is outrageous. I'm the victim here. She pointed at Sarah and Jake, her fingers shaking. They're the ones breaking the rules. Not me. But the cops didn't look at Sarah or Jake. They didn't care about the trampoline. The officer with the handcuffs stepped closer, and the other one put his clipboard under his arm. They weren't buying Linda's story, not one bit. Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't believe it. Arrested? Linda? For something illegal? She whispered to Jake, "Did you hear that?" Jake nodded fast, his eyes still huge. "What's illegal activity?" he asked. Sarah swallowed hard. "It means doing something bad that's against the law," she said. Jake's mouth made a little O. "Like what?" he asked. Sarah didn't answer yet. She didn't know the whole story. But she was starting to guess. Linda's face was bright red now, almost purple. She sputtered like a car that wouldn't start. "This is a mistake," she yelled. "I called you. I'm the good one here." She waved her arms again, but it didn't help. The officer with the handcuffs grabbed her wrist gentle but firm and clicked one side of the cuffs on. Click. The sound was loud in the quiet street. Linda yanked her arm back, but the officer held tight. "Ma'am, calm down," he said. "You're coming with us." Linda's eyes darted around, like she was looking for a way out. "You can't do this," she shouted. "I'm the HOA president. I make the rules." Sarah watched, her mind spinning. She remembered all those weird things she'd seen: the cracked open garage door, the strange cars at night. It wasn't just Linda being grumpy. She'd been up to something sneaky, something big enough to get the police involved. "Jake," Sarah whispered, "she's not just mad about the trampoline." Jake nodded, squeezing her hand. "She's in trouble, huh?" he said. Sarah nodded back. "Big trouble." Across the street, the second cuff clicked onto Linda's other wrist. She was handcuffed now, her arms stuck behind her back. She looked like a trapped animal, twisting and turning, but there was no getting away. The officer with the clipboard started talking again. "We've been watching your house, Ms. Perkins," he said. "We got reports about strange stuff going on. Turns out, you've been running a secret operation out of your garage." Linda's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She looked like a fish out of water. "That's ridiculous," she finally said. "I don't know what you're talking about." But her voice wasn't strong anymore, it was shaky, like she was scared they knew the truth. The officer shook his head. "We've got proof," he said. "Lots of it?" Sarah's jaw dropped even lower, if that was possible. A secret operation? In Linda's garage? She thought back to those cars again, the ones that came and went so fast. What was Linda doing? Selling something bad? Hiding something? Whatever it was shady enough to bring the cops right to her door. Jake tugged Sarah's sleeve. "What's an operation?" he asked. Sarah bit her lip. "It's like a plan," she said. "A sneaky one she didn't want anyone to know about." Jake's eyes got even bigger. "Like a spy?" he asked. Sarah almost laughed. "Sort of," she said. "But a bad spy." Linda kept arguing, her voice getting louder and squeakier. "This is wrong. You've got the wrong person," she yelled. "I'm a good neighbor. I keep the street perfect." But the cops didn't listen. They'd heard enough. The officer with the handcuffs started leading her toward the police car. Linda dragged her feet, her shoes scuffing the grass. "Let me go," she shouted. "I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone." But the officers didn't stop. They opened the car door, and Linda had to duck her head to get in. She glared out the window at Sarah and Jake, her face twisted with anger. Sarah couldn't move. She just stood there, holding Jake's hand, watching it all happen. Her mind was a tornado of thoughts. Linda wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was a criminal. All those times she'd yelled about rules, measured grass with her ruler, wrote nasty notes, she'd been hiding something huge. Sarah felt a little dizzy. Who saw that coming? Not her. Not Jake. Not anyone on the street. Neighbors were peeking out now: Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Carter, even little Timmy from 2 houses down. Their faces were shocked, their mouths open like Sarah's. Jake looked up at his mom. "She's going to jail?" he asked, his voice small. Sarah nodded slowly. "Looks like it," she said. She did something really bad. Jake frowned. But she said we were bad. Sarah squeezed his hand. She was wrong, she said. She was trying to trick everyone. Jake tilted his head. Why? Sarah sighed. Maybe to hide what she was doing. People who do bad stuff sometimes point at others to look innocent. Jake nodded, like he was starting to get it. The police car door shut with a loud bang. Linda was inside now, her hands cuffed behind her. She banged her shoulder against the window, still yelling, but the glass muffled her voice. The officers didn't rush, they walked back to the front of the car, calm as could be. The one with the clipboard said something into his radio, his words too quiet to hear. The other one started the car, and the engine hummed to life. Linda's face pressed against the window, her eyes wide and wild. She didn't look like the HOA queen anymore, she looked like someone who'd been caught. Sarah took a deep breath. Wow, she said, almost to herself. Jake let go of her hand and ran to the edge of the yard, watching the car. They're taking her away, he said, pointing. The police car started moving, slow at first, then picking up speed. It rolled down the street, past the neat houses and perfect lawns, with Linda in the back. Sarah walked over to Jake, her legs feeling a little wobbly. I can't believe it, she said. All this time, she was the one breaking the law. Jake turned to her, his face lit up with surprise. What do you think she did? He asked. Sarah shrugged. I don't know yet. Something sneaky in her garage. Maybe stealing stuff, or making something she shouldn't. Jake's eyes sparkled. Like a secret lair, he asked. Sarah laughed, finally a real laugh. Maybe, she said. A grumpy villain with a secret lair. Jake giggled. She's not a very good villain, he said. Sarah nodded. Nope. She got caught. The car disappeared around the corner, and the street went quiet again. The birds started chirping, like they'd been waiting for Linda to leave. Sarah and Jake stood there, letting it all sink in. Linda wasn't just annoying, she was a criminal. The cops had been watching her for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And today, when she called them about the trampoline, they decided it was time to grab her. Sarah shook her head. She thought she was so smart, she said. Jake grinned. But she wasn't, he said. We won. Sarah smiled at him. Yeah, we did, she said. The trampoline sat in the yard behind them, quiet now but still there. Linda had tried to get rid of it, but instead, she'd gotten herself in big trouble. Who saw that coming? Not Linda, that's for sure. She'd been so busy yelling about rules that she didn't see the real problem herself. Sarah felt a little proud. She and Jake hadn't done anything wrong, and now everyone would know it. The big reveal was over, but the story wasn't done yet. What would happen next? Stick around, you won't believe it. The wild Saturday afternoon was calming down, but the big drama wasn't over yet. The two police officers held Linda's arms, one on each side, as they walked her to their patrol car. Linda's hands were stuck behind her back in those shiny handcuffs, and she wasn't happy about it. She kept yelling, her voice loud and squeaky, like a broken toy. This is a mistake, she shouted, twisting her head to glare at the cops. You should be arresting them. She jerked her chin toward Sarah and Jake across the street, her face all red and sweaty. But the officers didn't even look at Sarah or Jake. They just kept walking, steady and calm, like Linda's words were nothing but wind blowing by. Sarah stood in her yard, watching it all with her arms crossed over her chest. A tiny smile started to grow on her face, not a big, loud grin, but a quiet one, like she knew something good was happening. Jake was next to her, still holding her hand until the car door opened. Then he let go and turned to look at Linda, his green eyes wide with surprise. The neighbors couldn't help themselves, they started peeking out. Mr. Thompson pulled his curtain back, his gray hair sticking up like he'd just woken up. Mrs. Carter opened her front door a little, her glasses shining in the sun as she stared. Even little Timmy from down the street ran to his window, pressing his nose against the glass. They were all whispering to each other, their voices soft but excited. What's happening? They said. Is that Linda? In handcuffs. Linda didn't stop yelling, even as the officers pushed her gently toward the car. I'm innocent, she cried. I'm the one who keeps the street perfect. You've got it all wrong. Her feet dragged on the grass, leaving little marks in her perfect lawn. The officer with the clipboard opened the back door of the patrol car, and the other one helped Linda sit down. She didn't want to go. She squirmed and twisted, but the cuffs kept her stuck. "You'll be sorry," she shouted. "I'll tell everyone about this." But the cops didn't answer. They shut the door with a loud bang, and Linda's voice got muffled behind the thick glass. She banged her shoulder against the window, her face twisted up like she was about to cry or scream some more. Sarah watched the car, her smile getting a little bigger. She turned to Jake and said, "Guess the trampoline wasn't the real problem, huh?" Her voice was calm, but you could hear the laughter hiding in it. Jake's face lit up. He started giggling, a bubbly sound that made Sarah laugh too. "Nope," he said, running back to the trampoline. He climbed up fast, his sneakers squeaking on the springs, and started bouncing again higher and louder than ever. Boing! 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 The thump 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 echoed across the street, louder than before, like Jake was saying, "Take that, Linda." Sarah clapped her hands and cheered. "Go, Jake," she called. "Show 'em how it's done." The trampoline shook with every jump, but it didn't matter now. Linda couldn't stop him anymore. Back at Linda's house, the officers weren't done. While one stayed by the car with Linda, the other walked to her garage. The big door was still cracked open, just like Sarah had seen all those times before. The cop pushed it up all the way, and sunlight poured in. Inside, there were boxes, lots of them stacked up high against the walls. Not normal boxes like you'd use for moving or storing Christmas lights. These were weird, taped shut with no labels, like they were hiding something. The officer pulled out a little knife and cut one open. He reached inside and pulled out stuffed papers, little bags, things Sarah couldn't see from across the street. But whatever it was, it made the cop nod to his partner. "This is it," he said, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "We've got her." Sarah's eyes got big. Boxes of evidence. In Linda's garage? She remembered those strange cars she'd seen at night, the ones that came and went so fast. It wasn't just Linda being grumpy or picky about rules. She'd been breaking the law, big time. Way worse than any HOA rule about grass or noise. Sarah whispered to herself, "No way." Jake stopped bouncing for a second and ran to her side. "What's in the boxes, Mom?" he asked, his voice all excited. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know exactly," she said. "But it's bad stuff. Stuff she wasn't supposed to have." Jake's mouth made a little O. "Like treasure?" he asked. Sarah laughed. "More like trouble," she said. "She's been sneaky, and now she's caught." The police car started moving, its engine humming as it rolled away. Linda was still in the back, her face pressed against the window, yelling something no one could hear clearly. The car turned the corner and disappeared, taking Linda with it. Sarah let out a big breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "She's gone," she said. Jake jumped up and down, not on the trampoline this time, just on the grass. "Yay," he cheered. "No more mean Linda." Sarah smiled and ruffled his messy hair. "No more mean Linda," she agreed. The street felt different now, lighter, freer, like a big weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. The officer in the garage kept working. He opened more boxes, pulling out more things, papers, bags, even some weird machines Sarah didn't recognize. He piled it all up on the driveway, making a big stack. Neighbors started coming out now, not just peeking. Mr. Thompson walked over, his slippers flapping on the pavement. "What's all this?" he asked the cop. The officer looked up. "Evidence," he said. "She's been running something illegal here. We've been watching for weeks." Mr. Thompson's eyebrows shot up. "Linda? Our Linda?" he said. The cop nodded. "Yup. Not just a rule stickler. A lawbreaker." Mrs. Carter joined them, her hands on her hips. "Well, I never," she said. "All those notes she wrote me, and she's the crook." Sarah listened from her yard, her arms still crossed. She couldn't believe it either. Linda had acted so perfect, so bossy, like she was better than everyone. But all along, she'd been doing something shady right under their noses. Jake tugged her sleeve. "What's a lawbreaker?" he asked. Sarah smiled down at him. "It's someone who does bad things they're not allowed to," she said. Like stealing or lying to trick people. Jake nodded. So she's not the boss anymore, he asked. Sarah shook her head. Nope. She's in big trouble now. The cops are the boss of her. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, turning the clouds pink and orange. The street was buzzing with people now, neighbors talking, pointing at Linda's garage, shaking their heads. Little Timmy ran over to Sarah and Jake, his eyes wide. Did you see that? He asked. They took Linda away. Jake grinned. Yeah. She tried to get my trampoline, but she got caught instead. Timmy laughed. That's so cool, he said. Can I bounce with you? Jake nodded fast. Sure, he said, and the two boys ran to the trampoline, climbing up and jumping together. Boing. Boing. Their giggles filled the air, louder than Linda's yelling ever was. Sarah watched them, her smile growing. She walked back to the porch and picked up her lemonade glass. The ice was mostly melted now, but she took a sip anyway. It still tasted sweet. She sat down in her chair and leaned back, feeling the day settle around her. Linda's reign as HOA Karen was overdone, finished, kaput. No more ruler measuring grass, no more nasty notes, no more tantrums about silly stuff. The cops had taken her away, and the boxes in her garage proved she wasn't the perfect neighbor she pretended to be. Sarah felt proud of herself, of Jake, of their little win. How's that for a turnaround, she said out loud, even though no one was listening. Across the street, the officer finished piling up the evidence. He called for another car, a big van this time, to come pick it all up. When it got there, 2 more cops hopped out and started loading the boxes. They worked fast, tossing everything in the back like it was trash. Linda's perfect lawn got messy, grass torn up from the car tires, footprints all over. Her flowers even got stepped on a little. Sarah almost felt bad for the flowers, but not for Linda. She'd made her own mess, and now she had to deal with it. The van doors slammed shut, and the cops drove off, leaving Linda's house quiet and empty. Jake and Timmy kept bouncing, their shadows stretching long across the yard. Higher! Jake yelled, and Timmy laughed, trying to match him. Sarah clapped again. You're both champs, she called. The other neighbors were still talking, their voices a soft hum in the background. Never thought I'd see Linda in cuffs, Mr. Thompson said to Mrs. Carter. She nodded. She had us all fooled, she said. Acting so high and mighty. They shook their heads and laughed a little, like they couldn't believe it either. The day was winding down now. The sun was almost gone, and the street lights flicked on, casting a soft glow over everything. Sarah looked at the trampoline, at Jake and Timmy having fun, and felt peace settle in her chest. Linda had tried to ruin their day, tried to take away the one thing that made Jake so happy. But she didn't win. She lost, big time. The cops had served justice, and it felt good. No more HOA Karen bossing everyone around. The street was theirs again, free for kids to play, for people to laugh, for life to be simple and happy. Jake jumped off the trampoline and ran to Sarah, his cheeks pink from all the bouncing. Mom, we beat her, he said, his voice full of glee. Sarah pulled him into a hug. We sure did, buddy, she said. You and that trampoline are the real heroes. Jake giggled and hugged her back. Timmy waved from the trampoline. See ya tomorrow, Jake, he called, then ran home as his mom yelled for dinner. Sarah and Jake stood there, watching the last bits of sunlight fade. The street was quiet now, no yelling, no cops, just crickets starting to chirp. Linda was gone, and justice was done. How's that for a happy ending? So, there you have it, a wild day that started with a boy bouncing on a trampoline and ended with a grumpy lady in handcuffs. Can you believe it? 1 minute, Jake was jumping up and down, having the best Saturday ever, and the next, Linda, the loudest complainer on the street, was being taken away by the police. It's funny how things turn out sometimes, isn't it? You'd never guess that a trampoline could cause such a big mess, or that the person yelling the loudest would be the one hiding the biggest secrets. That's what happened here, and it's a story worth remembering. Let's think about it for a second. The day began so simple. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Jake was bouncing like he could touch the sky. His mom, Sarah, was sipping lemonade on the porch, smiling at him. Everything felt perfect, like a picture from a happy book. Across the street, Linda seemed like just an annoying neighbor, the kind who gets mad about silly things like grass being too long or kids playing too loud. Everyone called her HOA Karen because she loved rules more than anything. She'd march around with her little ruler, measuring stuff, writing notes, telling people what to do. She acted like she was the boss of everyone, like the street belonged to her. But boy, was she wrong. Linda thought she could stop Jake's fun. She stormed out of her house, yelling about the trampoline being too loud, saying she'd call the cops. She pointed her finger and smirked like she'd already won. Jake got scared. He didn't want trouble. Sarah stayed calm, but she knew Linda was up to something. And then surprise, the police showed up, but not for Jake. They walked right past him and Sarah, straight to Linda. Turns out, she wasn't just a grumpy lady with too many rules. She'd been doing sneaky, bad stuff in her garage, stuff so bad the cops had been watching her for weeks. When they put those handcuffs on her, everything flipped upside down. Linda wasn't the boss anymore. She was the one in big trouble. Isn't that funny? The loudest complainers, the ones who act like they're perfect, sometimes have the most to hide. Linda yelled about the trampoline, but she was the real problem. She pointed fingers at Jake and Sarah, saying they were bad, when all along, she was the one breaking the law. It's like she put on a big show to trick everyone, waving her arms, shouting about rules so no one would look at what she was really doing. But the cops saw through it. They found boxes of evidence in her garage, proof that she wasn't the good neighbor she pretended to be. And just like that, her big act fell apart. Maybe next time you see someone pointing fingers, you'll wonder what they're up to. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who's loud and bossy, always telling others they're wrong? Maybe at school, there's a kid who yells about the rules in a game but cheats when no one's looking. Or maybe a grown-up who complains about little things but hides something bigger. Life's full of surprises like that. People who act big and tough are sometimes just covering up something small and sneaky. Linda thought she was the queen of the street, but she was really just a trickster who got caught. It makes you think, doesn't it? Let's picture it one more time. Jake's bouncing on his trampoline, free and happy. The cops drive away with Linda in the back, her yelling fading into nothing. Sarah's smiling, proud of her son, proud they didn't let Linda win. The neighbors come out, talking and laughing, amazed at what happened. The street feels light again. No more mean notes, no more grumpy glares. Linda's gone, and the trampoline stays. It's a happy ending, but it's more than that. It's a lesson, too. People who try to push others down don't always get their way. Sometimes, the quiet ones like Jake and Sarah come out on top, just by being themselves. What do you think about that? Ever met a Linda in your life? Maybe someone who's loud and bossy, but not as great as they think. I bet you have. Maybe it's a kid at recess who says you're playing tag wrong, but then they hide where no one can find them. Or a teacher who gets mad about messy desks but leaves papers all over the floor. People like that pop up everywhere, don't they? They act big, but sometimes they're just hiding something, like Linda with her secret garage stuff. It's funny when you figure them out, isn't it? You can smile and keep doing your thing, knowing the truth always comes out in the end. This story started with a trampoline, a simple, bouncy thing that made Jake happy. Linda tried to take that happiness away, but she couldn't. She ended up losing everything: her power, her perfect act, her place as HOA Karen. Jake kept bouncing, louder than ever, and Sarah kept smiling. The neighbors learned something new, and the street felt free. It's a big win for the little guys, the ones who don't yell or boss people around. They didn't fight or scream, they just stayed strong, and justice showed up to fix it all. That's pretty cool, right? It makes you feel good, like when you finish a game and know you played fair. So, what's the big idea here? Maybe it's this: don't let the loud complainers scare you. They might sound big, but they're not always right. Sometimes, they're just making noise to hide their own messes. Keep being you, keep bouncing, keep smiling, and things will work out. Linda thought she could control everything, but she couldn't control the truth. The cops came, the handcuffs clicked, and her game was over. Jake's trampoline stayed, and that's what matters. Life's funny that way. Surprises sneak up, and the good guys win when you least expect it. Think about your own days. Ever had a moment where someone tried to ruin your fun, but it turned out okay? Maybe a friend got mad about sharing toys, but then they tripped over their own pile and laughed. Or a bully said mean stuff, but everyone stuck up for you instead. Those little wins feel big, don't they? They're like this story proof that being kind and brave beats being loud and sneaky every time. Linda didn't see it coming, but Jake and Sarah did. They didn't need to yell or fight, they just waited, and the truth showed up with flashing lights and a patrol car. Let's imagine one last thing. Picture Jake, years from now, telling this story to his friends. There was this lady, he'd say, who hated my trampoline. She called the cops on me, but they arrested her instead. His friends would laugh, their eyes wide, asking, "Really? What happened?" And Jake would grin, remembering how he kept bouncing, how his mom hugged him, how the street cheered when Linda left. It's a story that sticks with you, a tale of a boy, a trampoline, and a big surprise. It's fun, it's crazy, and it's real. Well, maybe not real, but it feels like it could be, doesn't it? So, what do you think? Did this story make you smile? Did it make you think about the Lindas you've met? I hope it did. Life's better when we laugh at the silly stuff and cheer for the good stuff. If you liked this adventure, tell me below, have you ever had a day like Jake's, where the bad guy lost and you won? Drop your story, and let's share some fun. And if this tale made you happy, give it a thumbs up. It's like a high five for Jake and Sarah. They deserve it, don't they? Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. See you in the next one. Who knows what surprises we'll find next time.